power. It didn't become a real power for another 200 or 300 years, but that's when they start to emerge, because we'll see that they fit into the history of Daniel as well. In 722, we see North Israel deported. So North Israel was deported to Assyria. And of course, we have they're called the Lost 10 Tribes. And no one knows what happened to them. It could be that some of you, perhaps even I, have some Jewish blood in us. We don't know, because they were completely dispersed, and no one knows where they went from there. In 612, we see that Assyria I wrote down falls. They didn't exactly fall at that point, but they fell from preeminence. You saw Babylon starting to become more preeminent about 612 or so. And in 609, I don't have it on the list here, but in 609, we have the Pharaoh Necho from Egypt decided he wanted to play a part in the Mesopotamian power struggle. And so he went in that direction in order to promote Assyria. He wanted to combine with Assyria and become a power with them. As they were proceeding, we had Josiah, who was the last really righteous king, who went ahead and intervened. They intercepted Pharaoh Necho in the valley of Megiddo, and he fought against them because he didn't want them to be a part of that. However, during that time, Josiah got shot by an arrow, and he wound up dying. And a few years later, Egypt did meet with Babylon in a place called Carchemish, and we saw that Egypt lost terribly, decisively. Egypt was really trounced on, and they wound up being sent back to their own country, and they really didn't have much influence for the next few centuries. So, at that time, though, Daniel went to Babylon. So what happened after the Battle of Carchemish, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, he receives the kingdom. His father died in Babylon. He was crowned. He came into Judea, and he besieged the city. When he captured the city, he took Jehoiakim and exiled him to Babylon. At the same time, we saw that Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, I guess that is their Babylonian names, because I know it so well. They are all deported, and I'm sure other people were deported too, but they're the ones, of course, that stick out for the book of Daniel. We see that, we have Nebuchadnezzar setting up a king. That king rebelled again in 597. Nebuchadnezzar came back. Ezekiel, who wrote the book Ezekiel, is deported along with 10,000 to Babylon. So it's interesting because Ezekiel and Daniel were contemporaries, and they were exiled to the same place. There's a good chance they might have known each other. They might even have communicated. And then last of all, a few years after that, one more rebellion, and this time Babylon came in and Israel fell. They completely wiped out Israel, destroyed the temple, and then deported the people to Babylon. It so happens that once they're in Babylon and once Medo-Persia took over, they were treated very, very well. I not too long ago read The History of the Jewish Nation by Paul Johnson, which is an amazing book. It's definitely a long book. But he mentions in the book, with the exception of America, the Persians treated the Jews better than any other nation. So they had which is why when they were given permission to leave, so many chose not to leave, because they had it so well. And there again, in America, they've been treated very well also. So what we see through the rudimentary timeline is that God is involved in microhistory meaning like every one of our individual lives, and He's also involved in macrohistory, major things that are going on. Here He had Assyria take Israel, and then He had Babylon take Judea. You have all these big nations, which is encouraging to me because we look at our time and it's a little on the discouraging side sometimes looking at politics. But I remind myself, and will be reminded, that God is in control of nations, the fates of nations, and what happens. He's completely in control of everything about it. So let's turn our attention from there to the city of Babylon itself. It became the superpower of its day. Can anyone tell me, what is the origin of Babylon? Where did Babylon begin? Exactly. And where's that found? Do you remember? I mean, where in the Bible? Yeah, Genesis 11. So that's where Babylon is first mentioned. It's the plain of Shinar, which Bill's referring to, and that's where they chose to build a city because it was a good spot. This is the same place where they have Babylon. So it's the same exact place, and it's probably, if not the oldest city, it is one of the oldest cities in human history. And Taryn, are you back behind there? Could you flip back to picture number 1? It looks like the drawing picture. Yeah, if you don't mind. We'll look at that one in a second. There you go. Okay, we have for you engineers, I know we have several engineers here, so I thought I'd show the engineering city first. After Nebuchadnezzar became king, he engaged in a massive building project for the city. In fact, in excavations that have been done around Babylon, 9/10 of the bricks had Nebuchadnezzar's name on it. So in other words, he had it, they had it, when you make bricks, Nebuchadnezzar was here, or whatever it is, it's stamped into the brick. So he was heavily involved in a major building project. The dimensions of the city itself, now the city, of course, is like, think about Seattle. Seattle goes off way, it's huge. But the city itself was 2 miles by 2 miles in length and width. It incorporated 2,500 acres, so it's a huge, huge city. You'll notice that the city here, the Euphrates River goes right down the middle of it, and that's by design. In case this city is to be attacked, they would have an unlimited supply of water. However, if those of you that know Daniel history, you realize this is going to be their Achilles heel. But for now, they think it is the positive thing. They also designed it so that you had a moat all the way around the city from this river, and you had various bridges going across this moat as well as over the Euphrates itself. You'll notice you have canals here. There's canals up here as well that you can't see, because there's a couple places where in Daniel they're talking about, I was standing by the Ulai Canal. So in other words, he would have been outside the city on some canal. It is said that there are about 1,000 temples that were in the city of Babylon itself, 1,000. And when you look at the city, this is the north right here. You have the main entrance, which is the Ishtar Gate, which we'll look at in a few moments. You had the museum. There again, keep the museum in mind. And of course, we have the main palace after you go through the Ishtar Gate. If you continue on, you see the temple of Marduk. Marduk was the main god of Babylon. And just to the north of that was the Tower of Babylon. They recreated the Tower of Babel as one of their building projects. So you had a Tower of Babel there in the middle of Babylon. The tower stood 300 feet tall, give or take a little bit. Okay? As far as the walls go, there was a Greek historian, his name, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but I think it's Herodotus, and he is known as the father of history, Greek history. He visited the city about 500 AD or BC, and he said that the walls that surrounded the city were 80 feet thick and 300 feet tall. And he said there were 56 miles of walls. Now, modern archaeology hasn't confirmed that, but they do say that, yeah, it was massive, it was huge. But I'm not sure if Herodotus exaggerated a bit, but it was still huge and still massive regardless. Very, very significant. Inside the city itself, you would have had not only people living there, but you had all sorts of buildings that were dedicated to the disciplines taught in Babylon. You'd have a building dedicated to astronomy/astrology, a building to engineering, a building to law. You'd have a building to architecture. So different disciplines are taught. It'd be like a university building that's dedicated exclusively to, this is the architecture building. If you want to study architecture, you enroll in classes there, that kind of thing. So in that sense, they kind of had a modern way about them. It's pretty significant. Could we have the second picture, the artistic picture, put on there, Taryn, the one you had before? That's the engineer picture, the other one. There's the artist picture. So here, we're looking at from a different angle. This is the north. So the Ishtar Gate would be here. Again, this would be the palace. And inside here, you're going to have the Tower of Babel, and you're going to have the Temple of Marduk. And you can get a better idea of the moat that surrounded the city and how the river went through the city. And there again, it's just full of people and whatnot. And also one more thing too, which one of the 7 wonders of the world was Nebuchadnezzar credited with? Do you remember? Hanging Gardens, right. And archaeology has not been able to determine where that is yet within the city. They're not saying it wasn't, but they can't determine. But basically, he married a woman from the mountains, and she is said that she got homesick for, mountains and trees. So what he did is he made this walled area, wall upon wall with plants and stuff hanging over them to give the appearance of like foliage on the sides of mountains. So he wanted her not to be quite so homesick, and that's why he designed the Hanging Gardens. All right, anything else? And so there again, the Ishtar Gate would have been right here. That's the main gate. And Taryn, can we have that Ishtar Gate that we've been looking at? Right there. Very, very beautiful. This was the main gate. If you're going in, especially if you're going into the palace, you'd go through that gate and go to the right. Obviously, you can't just saunter on in there. I'm sure there'd be guards and whatnot. But the point is, take a look. It's beautiful. It has blue tile, and embedded in the tile, you'd have lions and dragons, and you'd also have yellow bulls. So, and all the gates were decorated this way or similar. So, Babylon was an amazingly beautiful city, and everyone that visited said the same thing. In fact, it was said to be the most beautiful city of its day. All right, that's all for the pictures. Thanks a lot, Taryn. The book of Daniel itself, the author is Daniel. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 2, he says, I, Daniel, did this and wrote this. Daniel is the one who wrote the book of Daniel. Turn to Matthew 24 just for a moment. Matthew 24, Jesus is talking. Matthew 24 and verse 15. Jesus is talking. He says, Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. My point is that Daniel is the author because he talks about this very event. So Jesus himself credits Daniel for being the author of the book of Daniel. Daniel is also mentioned in Ezekiel 14, verse 14. Oh, we'll look at that one too. Ezekiel 14, we'll take a quick look at that. He's mentioned in 3 different places in Ezekiel. Ezekiel 14 and verse 14. I'll go up to verse 13. Ezekiel's prophesying. He says, Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, and cut off from it both man and beast, even though these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst by their own righteousness, they could only deliver themselves, declares the Lord. So here you have Noah and Job, both are which extremely prominent prophets. And Daniel, though he's a contemporary, he's lumped right in there with them. So Daniel was an extremely significant man, and even Ezekiel knew it. And there again, Ezekiel quite possibly knew him. The book of Daniel is written in 2 different languages. It's one of the few books that has more than one language to it. The first part of Daniel, from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 4, is written in Hebrew, as well as chapter 8, verse 1 to the end of the book. Those sections are written in Hebrew. From chapter 2, verse 5 to 7:28, it's written in Aramaic. So that's kind of significant. We'll talk about that more in detail, why that probably is later, but it's written in 2 different languages. Daniel, along with Revelation in the New Testament, is considered apocalyptic literature. The word apocalypse is Greek, and it means unveiling, if you're copying your notes, or revelation. So it's unveiling or revelation. Now, while there are many books in the Bible that have apocalyptic sections, for example, Zechariah has a couple of apocalyptic chapters, Matthew has a couple of apocalyptic chapters, can't even say the word anymore. Daniel and Revelation both are thought of as being primarily apocalyptic books. The prophecies in Daniel are so accurate that critics have attacked it as being written after the events occurred, especially by people who don't believe in God and predictive prophecy. They say there's no way that this was predicted. This has to have been written as history by somebody who viewed it all, which, by the way, was the same thing they used to say about Isaiah 53, and then they found Isaiah 53 in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Oh, and it was 150 to 200 years before Jesus, and there's predicting Jesus' crucifixion. They used to say the same thing, that Isaiah 53 was written by an eyewitness and couldn't be real prophecy. Well, the books of Daniel have been also found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated from 150 to 200 BC. And many of the events in Daniel would have been occurring at that very time that these scrolls were written. So there again, even though people attack the Bible, parts of the Bible can't be real, well, it is real. And God has given lots of opportunity to find that out for a fact. Okay, just history and the book of Daniel. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we launch into the thing? Sweet. Okay. I'll read the first couple of verses here. Chapter 1, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. So, we see that Jehoiakim is taken captive, and this is the first of 3 deportations. If you look at your timeline there, you'll see 3. Starting 605 is the first, and then we have, what else do we have? 605 is the first, and then we have 597 for Ezekiel, and his 10,000, and then 586 when it's fallen. So it's first of 3 deportations. So again, Jehoiakim had become a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar, and he decided to rebel, that he was not going to pay his tribute anymore, which caused Nebuchadnezzar to come in and take over. In 2 Chronicles 36, it states specifically that Jehoiakim was chained up to bronze chains and taken to Babylon. It also talks about the vessels of Babylon, or the vessels that were taken from the temple to Babylon. Now, normally, when a nation would conquer another nation, they would take all their idols that they could find and bring them into their temple. What was the problem for Israel? There's no idols. I mean, from the perspective of the Babylonians, it's a problem. There's no idols there. So what they did is they went into the temple and they took over 1,000 vessels that they used for serving. And so they took the vessels in lieu of the idols that they would have gotten, and they put them in that museum that we showed you in the beginning there. Just inside the Ishtar Gate, there's a museum right there that they would have put them in to view. So that's what we have going on, and we'll take a look here from chapter 1, verse 3. Let's read through verse 7. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom were no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered them to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them. To Daniel he assigned the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Okay, so along with the vessels that were deported, Nebuchadnezzar had an additional idea. Now, I don't know if this was done by his father, or whether it's just an original idea. But the idea was that he gave an assignment to the chief of his officials, Ashpenaz. He wanted to establish an elite group of government officials to help him ruling the kingdom. Now, this group of government officials would be entirely reliant upon him for everything. So he would have, hopefully, a group of very loyal subjects. That's kind of the idea, to help him run the country. He's literally called, he's the chief official. He was the chief of the eunuchs, basically. That's what he was. And Nebuchadnezzar gave him the criteria to be followed. So first of all, in verse 4, we see they are to be the best of the best. No physical defect. The upper class, including people from the king's court. And they were also called youths, which in the Hebrew language means that somebody is probably a teen. So looking at somebody from the ages of 12 to 16 or 18. So we'll say about 15 or so. Excuse me. Also, they don't want just a blank slate. They want, in verse 4, somebody already endowed with wisdom. Somebody who you can look at them, you can talk to them, you can tell that these people have a fair degree of intellect. They've demonstrated the ability to learn. And also, they need to have an ability to serve in the king's court. Now, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? What kind of abilities do you think would be necessary to serve in the king's court? I'll grab my bottle of water here real quick. You're looking for somebody to serve, even say for the president or for the king's court. What kind of qualities would we be looking for? Loyalty. That's huge. That's a big one, right? What else? Trustworthy? Okay. What else? Peggy? Humility, which he's going to help by making them dependent on him completely. Good. Humility. What else? Anything else? Not slow to slip. Yeah, exactly. It goes with that loyalty stuff again. The last thing you want is your subject to be divulging information. Think about the Supreme Court thing that happened not too long ago, right? When they divulged that information about one of the decision about Roe versus Wade. I mean, that was huge, that leak. Go ahead, Dave. Okay, administrative ability, perhaps organizational skills. Okay, good. Anyone else? Teresa. Right. Yeah, how to act in a government setting. And that's part of the reason they'd be choosing people from royalty and upper class, because they've been in that setting, so they know what kind of, reverence to show toward a king. Bill, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, good. You've already been impressed upon with certain wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to use the knowledge that you have, so they're able to do that. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Good. Excellent. Anyone else? Okay. That's a good laundry list of things to be looking for. Loyalty, ability to communicate, humility, etc. Good. Excellent. Those are some of the things that you definitely would want. Also, verse 5 says that provision is going to be made, and it's from the king's own table. Now, when you hear that, it doesn't mean you actually go to the king's table, right? Otherwise, it'd be humongous. But it means that the food that's served to the king is going to be served to you as well. So some of it goes to the king from the kitchen, and some of it goes with you. What kind of food does the king eat? The best. The best of the best, right? So this is what these young people are going to get. They're going to get the best food out there because they want them to be a success. So their assigned course of study is, first of all, the literature and language of the Babylonians. Now, their formal language was called Akkadian. Akkadian was a language, it was a formal language. However, their spoken language was Aramaic, which is also spoken in Israel in centuries to come. So these youths were to not only learn the languages, but they were to be taught literature, history, religion, and the other disciplines of the Babylonians. Would this knowledge enhance their worship of God? What do you think? The God, Bill. Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly right. This is designed specifically for you, and this is whatever God you had. Now, it doesn't just mean the God, but if you were taken from another country and you had the god Baal or whatever, they would be trying to persuade you that he's not a god, but our God is. Now, what kind of horsepower would that argument have? Potential. Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. That's a lot of horsepower. You know, if your God was so powerful, then why were we able to saunter in and take you folks over? So there's a lot of horsepower behind that argument. Some parents and students face the same situation today. How about the schools in America? And I'm talking about not the good schools that still teach about God's Word and etc., but think about the Ivy League schools and whatnot that parents send their kids to. How are they educated? How does it compare with Babylon? The answer is really close, because their goal is to brainwash you. Their goal is to persuade you that there is no God, that evolution exists, and then every other garbage thing that goes along with that attached. Their goal, some professors have been known to say, my goal at the end of this semester is to persuade you there is no God. Great, what a way to start the class, you know. And we're going to talk to somebody named John first. You know, somebody find a Christian name and start attacking, right? So, yeah, it's not that much different. Although, thankfully, we have a choice. They didn't. Daniel and his friends were captured. They were picked out, and they're selected. So, I mean, I guess there is a choice, but it's not much of a choice, right? The other choice is probably this. Or you could come along and see the most beautiful city in the world. I've always wanted to see Babylon, you know, perhaps. And there again, you're talking about the best instructors. Along with the best food, you're going to have the best instructors given to these young people. The best meaning whatever it is they're teaching, it's going to be the very best of all. You have the best of everything. So we have Daniel and his friends are selected. And there again, Bill already kind of jumped on that. They get new names. And the reason why is because their old names all talk about God. So you have, for example, Daniel, which means loosely, God is my judge. You have Hananiah, which means Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael, who says, who is like God. Azariah means Yahweh has helped me. That's not going to work for Babylon. You know, it's not going to fly. So I'm sure Ashpenaz is going, got to get some new names. But you know what? We'll give you names kind of similar to the ones you have, so it's not so hard for you to adapt. So he gives them new names. But before we do, what do these names tell us about the parents of these young men? They were people of faith, more than likely. They selected names specifically to point to God, the real God. And so this is a tribute to the parents' faith as much as anything. I mean, we don't know how godly they were, but they made an impact upon these four young men at least. Their new names are going to glorify the gods of Babylon. So we have Belshazzar, which means loosely, lady, protect the king. And Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar considered Belshazzar to be his personal god. So this is the one he served most of all. Shadrach means I'm fearful of a god. Meshach means I am despised or humbled before my God. And Abednego means servant of Nebo. Now, Nebo was a Babylonian god of vegetation and writing. So, all these new names are to reflect either directly or indirectly the gods of Babylon. And again, as Bill was mentioning, the goal is to erase every vestige of their previous country, erase their memories, erase their vision, erase their religion. They want them to be completely Babylonian. And so they've done everything they possibly could. Now imagine the pressure put on these young men. Think about our young people who would be taken away and you'll never see them again. They'll never see their family again. They'll never see their home again. And then the pressure is more. You're going to have this requirement given to you, and may your God help you if you can't meet this requirement. Huge pressure. Another thought is, were they required to become eunuchs themselves? Many of the king's servants were. It's not said either way, but I think the answer to that's yes. And the reason I say that is because, unlike Joseph in Genesis, who had a wife and children, nothing is ever said about Daniel's wife or Daniel's children. It doesn't mean they didn't have them, but because of the custom of making high officials eunuchs, they probably didn't have the ability to have that. So I'm leaning in that direction. Not that it matters, just one of the interesting thoughts of it. Anything before we move on? Anything else? Yes, Al. That's true. And they are, he was saying that it's interesting that they would not just be made slaves, instead they're bringing them into court. I think they're still slaves, but what great slaves. What a great situation if you're going to be a slave, I guess. Yeah, definitely. And I think part of the reason, again, is you're buying their loyalty, you're making them dependent upon you. It's kind of like bodyguards. A lot of times people, even today, have bodyguards from another nation. You say, well, why would they do that? Well, they have no political ties to the nation that you're in, and they depend upon you completely, which means if you die, they're going to die, right? So it's a way that people, even in modern days, would have a bodyguard they could depend on because they have to depend on them completely. Okay, verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. We see that Daniel made up his mind. What kind of thinking do we call that? You make up your mind about something. Resolution? Another word might be? What's again? Conviction? A word that we use. Okay, go ahead. Faithfulness? I'm thinking intentionality. That's a word we use quite a bit in our family. Intentionality, but all these other words apply as well. This intentionality requires action to bring things under this decision. Okay, does anyone have any New Year's resolutions that they're incorporating starting today? I see people shaking heads, mostly no. Mine are to do the resolutions I didn't do last year, which have actually been going for a few years, but anyway. Resolutions. Well, he has a resolution. He has an intentional thought. not to defile himself. Now, this word, defile himself, is a word that would be used. If you are defiled, it means you cannot enter the temple to worship. So, for example, you've touched a dead body, or in this case, perhaps food, whatever. It would render you unable to enter the temple for worship for a period of time, or until you did a certain sacrifice. So Daniel wants to not defile himself, and it's through eating. Now, the question is, how is that eating the king's food defiling to Daniel? How is it that if I ate the king's food, I would be defiled, from Daniel's perspective? Dave? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. You got both of them that I was thinking, unless somebody else comes up with another. Number one is the food would be devoted to idols, especially the meat was devoted to idols, okay? And then you have what kind of food was on the king's table? You better bet they got bacon, right? What kind of king doesn't have bacon? Unless you're Jewish, right? So you got either it's cooked in pig fat or it is pig meat, which would render a person defiled ceremonially. So Daniel is seeking to not have to do this. Now, here's an interesting thought. Is there any reason for him not to decide this? He's made this decision. Would there be any reasons for Daniel to say, I'm not going there? Teresa? Okay. The temple's 600 miles away. You're not going to go worship. What else? Any reasons not to? There's a couple. Some might say that God was unfair to Daniel. What did Daniel do? He got yanked out of his home, and he's here. It's kind of unfair that this happened to him. God put him there, so why not partake? Why? God, you're the one that put me here. You knew what was going to happen. So yeah, I'm going to take part, right? But it's interesting to me that Daniel's making his decision not based upon his circumstances. All of us will have circumstances occur in our lives where to sin or to do wrong makes sense. It seems to make sense, okay? And it could seem to make sense to Daniel. Now, I'm pretty sure there were more than 4 men taken to Babylon, because it talks about the other youths. Now, it may have been other youths from other countries, or it may have been lots of others, but Daniel and his 3 friends are the only ones who did this, are the only ones who resolved in themselves. Basically, what they're saying is, I will live for God regardless of my circumstances. I will dedicate myself to God. Even though his circumstances stink, humanly speaking, I'm going to live for God no matter, which is a great New Year's resolution, if you don't have one, right? Regardless of my circumstances, I'm going to live for God. I'm going to be dedicated to him. Now, that's truly great. Now, there is a problem, though, with this decision. What's the problem? It could shorten your lifespan? Okay, true. In more ways than one. What else? There's a major problem. Dave? Exactly. He doesn't have the freedom to choose. I mean, he does, but then what Al says enters into the equation. You know, okay, no problem. Shh, right? Yeah, he's not in control. But God is in control. Look at verse 9 again. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. So God is already there blazing the trail. He is making it supernaturally that Daniel has given favor in front of Ashpenaz and what will turn out to be the overseer. So for some reason, God, they like him, and they aren't against him. So notice also Daniel's method. In verse 8, what does Daniel do? How does he seek to bring this about? Daniel? What's that? Well, this is before that. You should know that, Daniel. Just teasing you. What did he do to go about this? Right. He asked for permission. He even I think he said please. If he didn't, he does later. Yeah, he seeks permission. Now, interesting, we in America, we might expect him to claim victim status. I'm a victim. I was yanked out of Israel. It's not fair. Or if you're not a victim, you have, what's the word? Not victimhood, but, a sense of entitlement. He doesn't have entitlement either, right? He has kind of an idea there. Those two methods wouldn't work. Go ahead, Steve. Okay. That is hard to do. That's a good point, though. Jen, go ahead. Because then, right. Right. Otherwise, they go back to Al's solution, pulling out the sword, right? I appreciate that. Yes, he asked permission. He didn't assume anything. He asked permission, and he said, why? So that I won't defile myself. And he had to explain what that meant. And he got a hearing, at least, out of it. Now, Ashpenaz, his response was fear. Yeah, great idea. Then the king can have my head on a spike, And that seemed to be the end of it for Ashpenaz, right? So a lot of people would have given up right there. Well, Lord, I gave it a try, and they said no, and okay, But Daniel didn't. I mean, you notice that Daniel is persistent. Now, he's not belligerent, but he's persistent. Then he kind of enters in what Steve was talking about there. Daniel, in verse 11, he approaches his overseer. Now, in other words, this is the person who's directly responsible for them. Ashpenaz is responsible for the whole thing. This person, this unnamed overseer, is responsible for Daniel and his friends. So he approaches the overseer, and he has a suggestion. Please, verse 12, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Now, by the way, the word vegetables there doesn't necessarily mean just vegetables. The Hebrew word literally means sown things. So in other words, anything that you could plant by sowing would fall under this category. So it could have included wheat, it could have included barley, it could have included oats. So it didn't necessarily have to be vegetables. So given that sown food to eat for 10 days and take a look and see what you think. Deal with what you see. Okay? So Daniel doesn't give up. Now, I will say this. Ashpenaz could have just said, shut up. You're lucky you're even alive. Eat the bacon and shut up. He could have been. But like I said, God went before him and had prepared their hearts to actually listen. So, 10 days. The overseer's response. What was his response? In verse 14. He listened. He listened to what he said. He could have said the same thing that Ashpenaz. Lo, shut up and eat your food. Who do you think you are? I'm sure that Daniel's approach, helped things out. He wasn't entitled or a victim, but he listened. Now it also implies that if they don't pass the test, that Daniel is going to go ahead and go along with what they say. It doesn't say that, but that is the implication. Test this for 10 days and then judge according to what you see. Okay, so now we have this test. Now, is there any vested interest in the overseer with this test? Jen? Yes. that's true. Like a hunger strike. Okay. No. Maybe he would push it to that way. Yeah, maybe. I didn't think about that. Okay. But is there a vested interest with the overseer? The answer is yes. Each of you that have a job, that have a boss, there's a vested interest in your boss to make sure that you can do the job. And if you can't do the job, who's the big boss come to? You. And your employee is terrible. Deal with the employee. However, it's different here. Here they'll just kill you. If your employee's bad. And now this is a big deal. Okay, this isn't just working at a coffee shop. Nothing wrong with that, you know. But this is the king. This is a big deal. This had better succeed. He's investing a lot of money, time, and energy, and it better work. And so that this man, this overseer is willing to take this risk says a lot. He's willing to take the risk. But also Daniel frames it in such a way that there's an appeal. What if it does go bad after 10 days? Well, we just start feeding you the good food, and you'll get healthy again, and life is good. So in one sense, it's kind of a win-win. If they do look better, we continue the food, and I still look good, right? And if they look bad, they got to eat the good food, supposedly, and I still look good. So it's a win-win for the overseer. So what happens in verse 15, we see at the end of the 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So this is probably a result of good diet, number one, and also number two, God's blessing. I'll flip those. God's blessing, number one, and then a good diet, number two, right? So God blessed them in such a way that they were allowed to continue and not defile themselves for this food. That's amazing to me, remarkable that they had that. Go ahead, Taryn. That's true. What he said is it could have been that some of the king's food itself would have been unhealthy that they wouldn't have known then, but which we would know perhaps now. That's a good point. Didn't think about that. Go ahead, Steve. Yeah. Yes. Okay, good point. Abraham Lincoln one time was recommended that he hire a particular person for a position, and Abraham Lincoln said no, he wouldn't do it. And they said, well, why? I don't like the way his face looks. I said, what? So listen, at his age, he's responsible for his face. He's 40 years old, was he? Everybody over 40 is responsible for their face. So if you got a happy face, it's your fault. If you got a not so happy face, perhaps it's not your fault. He didn't like the way he looked because he felt that he would be, if his attitude is the way his face looked, I don't want him working for me. So thanks for bringing that up. Good. Better finish up. Verse 17. As for these four youths, God gave them knowledge, intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Then at the end of the days, when the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. We see the first thing in verse 17, God blesses them. And because he blesses them, they have an incredible amount of wisdom and knowledge. And there again, remember, they've been educated by the best instructors of the Babylonian University. And their whole goal has been to destroy them and destroy their faith. Well, not only do they not destroy their faith, but they're able to navigate in this world of this education better than the people who believed in it, so to speak. I think about Tom Hoyle, who's been here a few times and teaches about creationism. And I think it was either his master's degree or his PhD. He was telling a story where he took the courses, he knew all the answers for the evolutionary viewpoint, but then he would explain what he really felt, respectfully. And he passed. So there you have somebody there who he knows it all. He can quote chapter and verse to you about the evolutionary theory, but then he would say, but in reality, I believe in the Bible that says this. Daniel was given a special gift of great concern to the Babylonian empires and ancient empires in general are dreams and visions. Dreams and visions, they always would look for meaning and interpretation. And Daniel was given a special gift that he could read these things. He could interpret dreams, he could interpret visions, which gave him a special ability. We see verse 18 that Ashpenaz presents him to Nebuchadnezzar for graduation day, and they are interviewed. Have you ever had a tough interview for a job? Think about this tough interview. Oh, he's the King of Kings. What if he doesn't like me, Al? I mean, what if the interview goes bad? I mean, as it turns out, the interview probably would have been done in such a way that if you were amazing, you get to stay. And if it wasn't amazing, they might send you, in their case, perhaps back to Judea to be ambassadors for the king. But they were so good that they were allowed to stay. They says they were 10 times better than the current wise men that are already employed. Now that's quite a thing to say, 10 times better. And they entered the king's personal service. They weren't sent to another country. And we see in verse 21 that Daniel served for at least 70 years. So Daniel went from one king to another empire. There were a couple of periods where he wasn't active, but then he was pulled from retirement with Belshazzar. We'll see later. So Daniel served not completely, one way to say, end to end, but 70 years total was his ministry. Any takeaways, any thoughts that occur to you through our study of Daniel so far? Bill? Mm. Mm. Hmm. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Good. Absolutely. It is absolutely what's happening here. Thank you. Other thoughts, other points or takeaway? Joe? Yeah. That's right. And it was far worse back then. Nowadays, right, I hear they're more touchy-feely, whatever that means, but back then, no. Any other thoughts? All right. One thing I mentioned there I was thinking about was preparation for service equals blessing. There's no guarantee, but we should be always preparing for service. What does God want me to do? What does He want us to do? Each of us individually, and then a little bit more macro history as a church. What does He want us to do? And prepare to be a part of that. And let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you so much for the book of Daniel. Thank you for Daniel's resolve, for his intentionality. He says, I'm not going to do that. I want to do the right thing. His approach and how you blessed because of it all. It could have gone so much different, but because of your sovereignty, it did not. And Lord, I do pray for us. I mean, it's easy for me personally, and I'm sure several of us, to get a little on the depressed side. We see things happening in our country which are just so difficult to watch. But we got to remember, again, you are in charge. You are sovereign. And you are moving in the hearts of people individually and also as nations. And I pray that you would guide and direct our nation back to you, to turn our hearts to you. Lord, please be with Pastor Justin as he preaches your word. Fill him with your spirit, with zeal, with passion and power in you. Pray also be with the worship team, and may you bless them as they guide and direct, Lord, and turn hearts to you in worship. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.